So my name is Dr. Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez. I have a PhD in history from the University of Winchester in the south of England, and I've actually been studying art history for a lot longer than my PhD or anything really. My studies in art history belong already in college, so I've been doing that for 17 years, which sounds like a lot of time, but whatever. Now, the core of everything that I've always studied is culture, and from the specific lens of culture, art. Because out of all of the things that we do as human beings, I think art is maybe the only light of hope we have as a species in our history. Through art and through the development of culture, we can truly see that we are capable of beautiful things, not just of destruction, war, and damage, which is important, right? From the point of view particularly of the humanities. Now, the problem that we have with art history overall is that an incredible amount of art historians traditionally were not really historians, as in typical historians, but were not necessarily artists either. So they're kind of like a weird space in between. In fact, the vast majority of universities, for example, in the UK, that have history as a subject for your career, etc., do not have normally a kind of module on art history or whatever. It's supposed to be almost like a whole category of its own, which is actually not necessarily true, and that's the reason why I'm here with you guys, to help you understand how these two relate, why they're important, and where some of the misconceptions kind of come about. You see, traditional historiography doesn't necessarily deal well with art because, we historians like having things neatly allocated and having a beautiful timeline that follows a specific pathway and that doesn't get altered. And with art, that doesn't necessarily happen. We do have some situations where things are, cookie cutter in that sense, and we know this is this specific movement and it starts exactly at this moment in time and it ends at this precisely moment in time, etc., etc. But frankly, it's a very rare thing. Art overall is a completely self-referential, aspect of culture that we are often using to refer to previous elements on the past and that will continue to project itself to the future. So putting clear categories in art can sometimes be difficult and one of the biggest challenges for historians. Not just that, as you will hear me talk more abundantly and more explicitly in the lecture in specific contexts, one of the traditional challenges that we have as historians with art is the fact that there is no written source about it, if you see what I mean. The medium that you're working with is actually a canvas, a panel, a mural, whatever it may be, that doesn't have written text. Sometimes they may do, but it's a very rare occurrence. Art has its own language. It has its own way of actually speaking with us. And more importantly, and the reason why I, as a cultural historian, specialize in it, art, since the beginning of time, has been the most direct way that we human beings have had to communicate with each other. If you think about prehistoric art, it's literally, images on rock wall to either tell you what are we hunting or what are we worshipping or what are we hoping for life, right? It is designed for the masses. Even though many people that would commission art and would produce art would not necessarily be working for the masses, the reality is that anybody should be able to pick up a piece of art and look at it and at least understand something about it. But, because it doesn't have written words, we cannot analyze it supposedly in the same way than a text, which is rubbish, and I'll explain, as we go through the session more specifically. Botticelli is born and operates through the last sort of 50 years of the Middle Ages, of the 15th century. So how can he not be a product of the Middle Ages, if you see what I mean? Of course, this is the time period that for the vast majority of people is identified as the Italian Renaissance, but actually, and as hopefully or maybe you will see in another one of our lectures very soon, the birth of the Renaissance is a medieval product. The Renaissance is a medieval product that happens and originates specifically in Italy, in the region of Tuscany to be precise, where Botticelli is actually going to be born and where he's going to carry out the vast majority of his career. And why do I say that? Well, because, in art, something doesn't just poof pop out of thin air. It's a long process that takes sometimes, centuries, maybe even millennia to transcend itself. So Botticelli is a very interesting artist because the reality is that the art that he's doing is kind of Gothic on steroids, right? That is, in many ways, what he's actually creating is not quite exactly Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, the great masters of what becomes the international highlight of, high Renaissance for everybody. He is just before them, cruising just in that gray area of the later Middle Ages where so many different ideas are flowing. And that's the reason why he's a very interesting artist to look at, because in many ways, and as you're going to find out when we look at the slides on the specific paintings, Botticelli is often creating the first of what will become a trend later on, or trends that are perceived to be more popular in the Renaissance, but that were already being created by the medieval societies of Europe, particularly in Italy and the Netherlands. The Dutch actually have a lot of influence in Botticelli. So the importance of understanding Botticelli as an internationally Gothic artist, but also a Renaissance artist is very important. And I've just thrown here a couple of words that I would like to, break down a bit more. International Gothic is what we normally call in art history terminology to the, let's say, bog standard idea of what Gothic art is in Europe, which is, the period of the later Middle Ages, from the transition point in the 12th century until indeed the 15th century. In some cases in Europe, like for example in the UK, actually that's not the case. In the UK, particularly in England, Gothic goes all the way up to Tudor times. But the general idea of international Gothic are those, last few hundred years of the Middle Ages. However, the idea of Renaissance starts a little bit earlier, and that's the reason why when we talk about these ideas, we need to be very careful. And one of the very most important things that I want to ask you is to keep your mind open and flexible in terms of art concepts, terms, and labels. Labels can be very dangerous when we are understanding art, because if we just classify one thing as this or that, then we don't have space for the in-between, which often is where art makes magic. So Botticelli is in that middle space where what he's doing, it's very important at that moment in time, is going to become very influential, very referential for the artists that will come after, and for a great scope of artists operating in the later stages of the 1400s, but that will be completely obsolete by the time the three great masters like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael will, crash into the scene, because they take that stuff that Botticelli was working with and they just propel it to a whole new level that fits the cultural standards, humanistic standards, religious standards, etc. of a whole new era. And the reality, for example, is that, right, Botticelli and Leonardo are actually kind of working for a little while around the same time period and with similar concepts, but the life circumstances of Leonardo are very different, and as much as they're both considered great masters of art, we can't really compare Botticelli and Leonardo in that regards, because Leonardo really has a mind that is so exceptional, that is really ahead for his time. That's not to say Botticelli is not ahead of his time, but the way in which he's going to have that ability to create direct effect and impact is going to be a lot more limited, because the very rapid changes that are going to happen in Italian societies, first and foremost, throughout the first few decades of the 16th century. But that is why Botticelli actually is a Gothic artist, a medieval artist, and why then the pre-Raphaelites will try to bring him back to be the champion of art in the 19th century, because the problem that Botticelli has is that it goes forgotten for a really long time, since it's considered to be not as good as the others. Something, of the Dark Ages, of the Middle Ages, which is not so cool, not so important, not so enlightened and, new or I guess renovated as the Renaissance is. And it is within the space of all of these that I've been mentioning that the session takes place. So what we're going to be looking at is looking at specific paintings of Botticelli, while I also give you a general overview of him, And painting by painting, which is, by the way, in chronological order, you will be able to see, first of all, the evolution of the artist. Second of all, the evolution of the times, a lot of cultural problems, a lot of issues that we have when understanding art, and those, fluid subjects that make the art of the Middle Ages actually very interesting and very special. So I hope that you find this, useful some way.